Let's get started. I am up first today, and as you can see here, this is, as you know, presentation rules and common myths debunked. And what I want to introduce first the Turpin team, and then we'll get started with the content here. I'm Dale Ludwig, president and founder of Turpin Communication. Greg Owen-Boger is our executive vice president, and Kevin Vogelsang is our operations manager. Although today in this webinar, Kevin is our host or our producer, whatever term you use to describe that role. But he is going to be in the background, making sure that everything goes smoothly for us, maybe chatting with us through our separate channel to say things like, you're running out of time or things like that. But anyway, Kevin is the one managing processes behind the scenes. And what we're focusing on today is why some advice that you may have gotten about delivering presentations is unhelpful and what to do instead. A little bit about Turpin Communication. If you don't know us, I won't spend much time here, but we are communication consultants and trainers focusing on three different types of business communicators. Left to right, we work with presenters, we work with meeting facilitators, and we work with trainers. And as you can see over there, the book image on the right is a book for SMEs, helping SMEs become effective trainers. But all of these things are business situations. We work with a variety of folks in the business world. And what I want to point out before we even get into the details of debunking and the myths that we're going to be talking about is that one of the fundamental concepts here at Turpin is that we want all of the people that we work with to find your focus, be yourself, only better. And I bring this up because many of the things we'll be talking about today get in the way of the need to do these three things. And let me explain what they are for just a second. First of all, if we look at the middle phrase, be yourself, we don't want to turn presenters or trainers or whoever we're working with into some carbon copy of someone else. You want to be yourself, you want to be who you are, and fully engaged in the conversation that you're having. And many of the things that we're talking about get in the way of that because they don't help you be only better. When you're delivering a presentation, you need to be working a little harder than normal to pay attention to what's happening around you and what the people in the room need from you. And so I think that you can't do that if you're not comfortable and fully engaged and yourself. Now, the training we do helps people find their focus, meaning that everybody gets different advice from us. It may be similar to what someone else gets, but we really try to get to know each person that we work with so that we can say, I think fundamentally the issue for you is X. And once you focus on that, you get comfortable and everything flows smoothly. So the idea that you can take a set of rules and apply them to everyone is absolutely antithetical to the work that we do. So the question we try to answer is what works uniquely for you? So let's look at these rules and myths that we're going to be focusing on today. There are 5 of them. The first one is presentations are performances. That's a fundamental idea that many people have. Presentation rules must be obeyed all the time. There are set things that must happen in every presentation. Third, here's a big one, practice makes perfect. And we'll talk about that in more detail in a bit. Avoid eye contact if you're nervous. This rule goes all the way back to when I was about 17, sitting in a high school classroom with a speech teacher who was saying, when you deliver your speech, look at the clock on the back wall. And I thought that was odd at the time, and it was, but it certainly is an idea that there's a connection between controlling nervousness and not looking at people. That is still with us today. And never ever read from your slides. This is another granddaddy of the presentation rules that many of you have probably heard. Now, some of these, the top 2 here especially, are assumptions that we make about what needs to actually happen during a presentation. And we'll be talking about those broader concerns first. But these ones at the bottom 3, are really more rule-based. And we'll be talking about where those rules came from and why they may not be appropriate for you. So how'd we get here? Many of these ideas are built on faulty assumptions. The idea, for example, that presentations are performances is a faulty assumption that we need to get rid of. And many of them treat symptoms and ignore the root cause. This is by far the more common, I think. Well, maybe not the more common. Maybe they're connected in some way. But looking at someone and saying, you gesture too much, stop gesturing, is not getting at the root cause of the strange gestures or the nervous gestures that person might be making, or saying, slow down is also tough feedback to apply because it's difficult to find a way to naturally put more space between the words that you are delivering. And so what you want to do from our perspective is dig in and find out, well, what's going on? Why are those gestures this way? Or is the speaking pace that's too fast, is that a result of nerves? If so, then we need to approach it from that direction. So we're trying to take a little more thoughtful and more practical approach to the ideas that we're delivering today. Because what happens when you try to follow these rules is you can get really frustrated or you can get more nervous. We'll be talking about that in a bit. And you might drive your audience crazy. You might have a group of people like that sitting there saying, what is going on here? What is that person trying to do? Because whatever it is, it's not working effectively for us. So we're going to try to clear away a lot of these assumptions and rules and give some practical advice. So that's our goal today, giving you permission to toss out some of the rules that don't work for you. And Greg, I'm going to turn this over to you to get us started with these ideas.
Yeah, let's go ahead and get at the very first of the rules that we are going to debunk, which is that presentations are performances. As you can see here, that's number one here. And as Dale touched on, almost everything else we are going to talk through today stems from this faulty notion that a presentation must be a performance. So let's go ahead and dig in. So as we see right here on this slide, we are making a very big distinction between a speech and a presentation. A speech, as we can see on the left-hand side of the screen, creates distance between the speaker and audience. You can see here that our speech maker is standing on a stage. He's at a podium. He has something that looks like some sort of a teleprompter in front of him, and he's speaking to a very large group. Now, I don't want to beat up on speeches because there is a legitimate place for speeches, because as the bottom left of the slide shows, they are intended to inspire. But I would question whether any of you have ever actually delivered a speech. And if you do, you probably don't do it very often. Even for those of you who speak at conferences, it's going to be more of a presentation. It's going to lean more over onto the right-hand side. So let's talk about what exactly is a presentation. Well, a business presentation brings speaker and audience together to get business done. In other words, to move business forward. That is a very different goal than that of a speech, which, as we've already said, is to inspire. So a speech, we can agree then, is a performance, and a presentation is more akin to a conversation. So if we were to Google, don't do this now, I've already done it for you. If we were to Google presentation skills training, check out what we would come up with. There are a few different results that I want to shine a light on. So over here, the very first thing that pops up is a communication training company that treats presentations clearly like a performance, because the speaker here is on a stage, she's holding a microphone, she's talking to a very large group. Again, that's not what we do day to day. Now, the guy down here advertising this particular training company is a little closer to what an actual presentation is. But when was the last time you used one of these presentation sticks to point things out? Ross Perot, if you are of a certain age in the United States, probably the last time you saw one of these antenna things was when Ross Perot was running for president many years ago. Now here we have yet another provider, again, a podium, a microphone. Here we've got a cartoon version of it. Here we've got another microphone. Over here, we're starting to get a little closer to a microphone, and yet it's clear that this is not a getting business done presentation. But then let's slide over here and let's look at little old us. We actually are on the front page of Google, which makes me very happy because I'm the guy that tries to make that happen. So does Kevin, but we work together to do that. But we've actually written an article about this, and it's on our blog, and we're going to give you a link to it a little bit later. But the thing that I really want to focus in on is that there are very few training providers out there that are actually making this distinction. In fact, so many of those providers are actually helping people deliver a TED Talk. Now, I have nothing against TED Talks, but TED Talks are performances. And so when you start to think about what can I do to improve my presentation skills, looking at TED Talks is not the way to do it, because those are very tightly choreographed. They are rehearsed, they're memorized. That's not what you do day to day.
Can I
So
interrupt for just a second, Greg?
please, yeah.
I want to make a couple of points. Sorry, I hope this doesn't throw you off, but as far as the TED Talks go, I because so many people come to us and say, "Oh, I want to be like a TED Talk." I bought a book that said, how to do a TED Talk, and I knew because I wanted evidence to basically to say, no, you're not doing a TED Talk because TED Talks are so incredibly timed, rehearsed. There's a hysterical video on YouTube making fun of delivering a TED Talk. We should include that here. That'd be a good addition because it talks about the pauses and the pacing and the movement across the stage that is so choreographed. So that's one thing. And the other thing is, remember that image you had up just a second ago with the conference room with two video screens at the front of the
Yeah,
room?
this guy right here.
We have a client whose meeting rooms look like that. And when you think about it, that is absolute, and it's a small room. These are small rooms with, kind of a conference table in the middle, maybe a dozen people would fit in there. And why, unless you're beaming somebody in from the outside with Zoom, which they weren't doing, why would you need two screens at the front of the room? Because it it's creating distance between the speaker and the people who are listening. It's
And
making
those,
it a much more formal setting than it needs to be. Go ahead.
right, and the screen is showing us exactly the same thing. And the two
Oh,
screens are literally 6 inches from each other, right?
right,
I mean, it's
right.
it's so bizarre that someone would think that that was a good idea. Okay, so if we can agree that a TED Talk, a speech, is not what we actually do, and it's more of a presentation, we can also agree then that the success of your presentation occurs by way of the conversation. So if we can put communication on a continuum, with conversation being on the left-hand side, being the least formal communication situation, and speech all the way over on the right, we can see that meetings and presentations fall there in the middle. And we're going to call those things orderly conversations. So Dale said we've written a couple of books over the years, and The Orderly Conversation was actually the very first book. So let's define what an orderly conversation is. It's orderly. It requires preparation, accuracy, and structure. So if you think of today's webinar, it's actually a conversation. It's not a speech, it's a dialogue. Clearly, Dale and I are bantering off one another, and we would certainly hope that if you have a question, you would feel comfortable enough to ask it either by taking yourself off mute or just dropping into chat. But there is a certain amount of order that we've brought to the conversation. But what's happening right now is the conversation. And that requires engagement, spontaneity, and interactivity. So what that means then is when we're preparing for an orderly conversation, we always need to be looking ahead to the uncertainties of the conversation. And then once the conversation starts, we're adapting what was planned to what's happening in the moment. Now let's put ourselves back in the world of that TED Talk or that speech. That is not what they are doing. In fact, if they were to get a question, it would throw them off because it would pull them out of the script that's in their head. Now, this definition of an orderly conversation, as you can see, can be applied to lots of different situations. But at the bottom of the slide, it says any outcome-oriented communication that's prepared, well organized, and takes place in a responsive conversational way. So if we go back to this notion that presentations are performances, clearly we can debunk that one right away. Now, let's move into the next piece, which is presentation rules must always be obeyed. Now, presentation rules were developed for a good reason. They were an attempt to solve a very real problem, but they don't always work. So let's get at it. This rule is one, it's one of the things it's just a total head scratcher for me. Never use more than 6 bullet points per slide. In fact, if you were to Google that, which I've done here, what's the presentation rule for the number of bullets? You can see someone says it's simple. The rule states that you must use no more than 6 bullets on a slide with no more than 6 words in a bullet. And designing your slides this way keeps your message concise. Now, I don't argue with the concise piece. clearly 6 bullet points are more concise than 9. But we're going to give a big ol' eye roll to this rule, and here's why. Let's imagine for just a moment that Walt Disney, back in the day, he read this Grimm's fairy tale story about Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. But because he has to report to the board of directors, he decides he's going to give a PowerPoint presentation to the board. Now, I realize how ridiculous that is because PowerPoint didn't exist then, but just stick with me. The problem for Walt is that someone on the board of directors called him into the office one day and said, you need to make your presentations more concise. Walt, no more than 6 things per slide. And Walt's thinking, well, now what am I supposed to do? I've got Snow White and these 7 other dwarfs that I need to make this presentation about. So his logical way of following this rule is to split the 7 dwarfs up onto 2 slides. So here we have Doc, Sleepy, Dopey, and Grumpy on slide 1 of 2. And on slide 2 of 2, we have Happy, Bashful, and Sneezy. This is not useful in the business world because it's the grouping of the 7 dwarfs that make his concept come to life. So what we need to do is we need to be pragmatic about using these rules and following these rules. So as the definition of pragmatic says, dealing with things sensibly and realistically in a way that is based on practical rather than theoretical considerations. So we are always going to say the rules were meant to solve a very real problem, but you have to be pragmatic about following them. So we're debunking rule number 2. All right, Dale, let's get into practice makes perfect. I'm going to stop sharing my slides so you can share what you have to say about practice makes perfect.
All right, let me get my slides ready to go. And as I do that, I want to point out that you could have one bullet point on a slide and be really verbose. I mean, there's no cause and effect relationship between what's on the slide and what you're saying. So that's the one that I thought as you were going through that, Greg.
Yeah, and as I was just reading the chat, someone says, Janice says, I love the word pragmatic. All right, good for vocabulary today.
Okay, practice makes perfect. Let's go into that. Oops, here we go. Oh, I want to back up. Sorry about that, everybody. It's my finger hitting 2 keys at once. Practice makes perfect connects back up to the first rule here, that presentations are performances. Because if you think about it, if you're going to deliver a speech, or if you're going to do a TED Talk, or if you're a musician and you're looking at a piece of music all marked up with where the rests are and when it's supposed to be louder or softer or faster, when you practice that, you are trying to hit exactly the mark that is given to you in that script or given to you on that sheet of music. And of course, that's not a conversation. But so perfection isn't the goal that you're after because, well, it's inappropriate and unachievable for a conversation. And so you also have to think about what practice actually means. And I'm going to be getting to that at the end of this chunk. But let's get into what can happen when you assume that practice makes perfect. We have here one of the characters in the orderly conversation, and let me just give you a little highlight about why we have characters in that book. The book is written by both Greg and me, and there are sections of it where individuals that we made up but are very real, Jennifer being one of them, is coached in a training class to improve her presentation. So Jennifer's character works in accounting. She's analytical. She's extremely nervous, and she rehearses at night with her fiance, which I think is a very funny thing that Greg threw in to imagine the poor fiance listening to Jennifer practice her accounting presentation. But here's the assumption that Jennifer was making. Because she's very, very nervous, she wants to, as you can see here, well, let me just read through this. I'll stop talking about it. Here's what Jennifer thinks. I'm going to be nervous, so I'll rehearse. And that's going to give me control over what I say. That's going to give me confidence, which will reduce my nerves so my presentation will succeed. That's her whole mindset going into any presentation that she delivers. Now, unfortunately, things don't always go the way that she planned. So, oh no, I'm not saying things the way I planned. which frustrates me. Now I'm really nervous. Next time I'm going to rehearse more. So she's assuming that if she can just get it down, absolutely nailed down to a perfect point, nothing is going to go wrong. And that is never going to happen. Because what if Jennifer is asked a question? She could easily be thrown off by that. And if you're the type of presenter or know the type of presenter who says, please hold your questions till the end, unless there's some sort of time crunch happening, there's really no good reason to do that. It's just that that person doesn't want to be pulled off track by a question in the middle of the presentation. And of course, the purpose of the presentation is probably to be pulled off track because you're getting a reaction from your audience and they want information about what you've just said. So the reality is rehearsal, which is what Jennifer is doing, not just practicing. Rehearsal can increase nervousness. So make that distinction in your mind. It's not bad to be prepared. It's not bad to talk through or think through your slides, but you don't want to rehearse. Because remember, we're dealing with an orderly conversation, and only part of this, half of this, is orderly, and you don't want to get in the way of the conversation. So as you prepare, you look ahead to the uncertainties, as you can see at the top of that image, and then at the bottom, you want to adapt the plan to what's happening in the moment. So it's adaptability that you're really after, not perfection. And here's the slide about preparing, various options that you have. So after your slides are created, there are really four things you can do. Two of them not recommended. One of them that's not is over on the left, winging it, meaning prepare your slides and don't even look at them until you start your presentation. Not a good plan. On the other side, we have rehearsal, which is that incredibly controlled approach that Jennifer took, and that's not a good one either. So we always recommend getting your head together or dry runs. And I'll define each of these things starting with dry run. If one of our clients is the land of dry run of their presentations. They do them constantly, and many of the people in that organization really hate it. But dry because they do too many. But the a dry run is simply a way for you to get a sense of how long it's going to take you to move through the information you have on your slides. Especially important to do if you're working as a team. You need to know how much time each person gets for their portion of the presentation. Yesterday, Greg, Kevin, and I did a dry run of this webinar. This morning, Greg gave us the timing that he's recommending, saying, okay, give it back to me by this time. Wonder how I'm doing on that, by the way. Anyway, that's the purpose of a dry run. You are not after perfection. You're not laying anything down in stone. You're simply talking through the presentation. Now, getting your head together is something we do when we know how long it's going to take us to deliver information. Let's say it's a webinar we've done many times or a class we've done many times. The idea of getting your head together is just thinking, all right, what's the through line here? What are the slides? I usually put my slides in slide sorter to get a sense of the overall flow, just to jog my memory so that I'm ready to go. Again, I'm not trying to perfect anything. I'm just getting a sense of where this conversation that I'm going to have with a certain group of people is going to go. So there's, yes, Greg.
Sorry to interrupt you, Joe, but I want to make the point that a dry run is the time to discover that the connective tissue is off. In other words, I don't understand how I'm transitioning from this thought to that thought. And so then the exercise becomes, okay, let's figure it out. And maybe you need to make some changes to the slides. You know, we made lots of changes to slides yesterday. And then in response to that, you and I both made additional changes to these slides this morning because we want to be able to make sure that those connections are there or the trouble spots aren't evident to the audience. Now, as those words are coming out of my mouth, I've got a trouble spot coming up. We'll see if I can get.
Oh boy.
We'll see if I can get it right. But I'm hoping that the fact that we did that dry run yesterday and that I ran through it a couple times was actually the type of preparation that I needed to make sure that my next batch of slides actually is clear.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you for that. And one more thing about this topic, we ask people all the time in every workshop, how do you want to be perceived by the people you work for and the people you work with? It gives us a bottom line set of goals for each person that we can then help them achieve. And the thing to remember is that your success occurs by way of the conversation. And no one has ever said to us when we ask them that question, I want to be perfect. They say things like, I want to manage the group, or I want to be able to handle difficult people, or I want to be be trustworthy. They don't ever say, I want to be perfect. So remembering that it is conversation is at the bottom line, it's a conversation and it's something that has to be alive, which a script sometimes isn't really alive. It's this a conversation is something that takes on a life of its own once the presentation starts. Okay, let's move on to eye contact. So we debunked practicing eye contact. Avoid eye contact if you're nervous. Let's talk about that. Okay, going back to this image, the conversation side. If you're having a conversation, you have to be connected to the people that you're talking to. Now, which is why communicating in Zoom is so frustrating because the real genuine connection rather, isn't there. And so we have to find ways to make it appear like a conversation or to react in ways that are conversational through technology. But if you assume that it is a connection to your audience that you're after, you got to think about eye contact a little bit differently. Because if you don't, you end up, let's say it's a face, obviously this guy's in a room, a real room, and let's say there's a presentation going on and he's standing in the corner looking at the bricks. It's not focusing on eye contact, not establishing eye contact is pretty much this. You're cutting yourself off. You're in your own world. You're not able to react the way you need to react. And in this situation, just send an email. I mean, if you're not prepared to interact with your audience or respond to them in any sort of genuine way, you don't need to have a meeting or a presentation. Just write it down, send it out. So establishing eye contact is really important because you need it to connect and observe. So avoiding it because you're nervous is not going to work. So let's look at engagement at a definition. Eye contact helps you engage, which, as you can see at the bottom of the slide, makes you able to think on your feet. As you can see with this image, these two people are talking. They're really having eye contact with each other, and it's a real conversation. So with strong eye contact, you are self-aware and you're in control. You're feeling comfortable, which goes against, it helps with the nervousness. You know instinctively what to do and say as an everyday conversation. This kind of goes back to the scripting thing or the practicing thing. You you know what to say because you're really engaged with that person and you're able to think and you're able to read the room, which is really important with any sort of face-to-face communication. And the larger the room, the more important it is to try to pay attention to how people are responding. So eye contact actually reduces nervousness. This is something that we discovered a long, long time ago because it wasn't obvious because when I started, my first exposure to business communication was at another company, and they talked about eye contact, but they didn't really make the connection between strong eye contact and reduced nerves. And when we discovered that, Greg, when we discovered this at Turpin, it was like, oh, of course, that it is going to improve nervousness. It's going to reduce it. It's going to make you feel more comfortable if you are really seeing the people that you're looking at. And that sort of cause effect was new to us. And once we realized it, it was like, how do we miss this? How could this not be the most fundamental idea that anybody taking a course in how to communicate better gets it? Yes, great.
Yeah, and I think about engagement, we all know what it feels like to be engaged in a conversation because we do it every day in low
Mm-hmm.
stakes situations, at dinner, with friends and family, even in the office. And yet when we turn a conversation into a presentation, there's something around raising the bar, the nervousness starts to kick in. And even if you aren't a nervous presenter, there's still this notion of heightened reality almost, right? And then eye contact, because we're thinking so hard, tends to take a back seat. And we really need to be intentional about using the eye contact because we can then rely on our natural instincts to zig and zag with the conversation. Again, because we do it all the time.
Right. Yeah, thank you.
Yep.
Okay, so we've talked about avoiding eye contact to to deal with nervousness and talked about the connection that is necessary in a conversation. Greg, I think that you can go on and do for some people, the granddaddy of all of these myths, and that is never to read from your slides.
It really is the granddaddy. You know, if you are on LinkedIn, I can almost guarantee that you see an article probably once a week that says something about, never read from your slides. Well, guess what, folks? We've been reading our slides the entire time. So let's figure out where this rule came from and what we can do to make it make sense for each of us. So here's what I'm going to do. I am going to show you a very wordy slide, and I'm going to ask you to think about my delivery of this slide. So here we go. You know, the rule for never read from your slides comes from a good place, because what people were doing is they were just putting all this text on slides, lots of sentences, full paragraphs, and then they ended up reading all of that. And that caused a lot of frustration for everybody involved. And then they wouldn't even go on to expand on what they were already saying. All right, now I just blacked out the screen to take away the distraction of the slides.
Actually, Greg, you didn't black out the screen.
Oh, I didn't. I meant to. It's blacked out on my screen. So let me just stop sharing then, and we will talk about what you just experienced. So there were a lot of words on that slide, and I didn't read the slide. Instead, I was saying something different from what was on the screen. There was a connection to it, but it wasn't exactly what was there. And so it probably created a disconnect between what you were reading and what you were hearing from me. So let's unpack this a little bit more. Let me go back to that slide. Go to the next one. So let me ask the question, and you don't need to answer this, just in your own head. Did you read the text? Did you listen to me? Did you try to do both? Or did you eventually just give up because I was making it too hard for you? In any case, I failed to deliver a clear message to you. So we need to figure out what would be a better approach. So let me try this different approach and we'll see what we think. So the rule about reading from slides comes from a good place. What people were doing is they were adding too much text. They were reading paragraphs and full sentences and causing confusion for people because they wouldn't say anything else and then they would just move on.
Hey, Greg,
Yeah.
sorry to interrupt you. We're getting that weird Zoom thing where there's like a gray bar across your slides. Can you just maybe stop sharing and reshare?
I sure will.
That fixes it.
Yeah.
Thanks, Kevin. I was hoping it would just magically go away, and it didn't.
Did it go away?
Yeah, that's good.
Yes.
Okay, do I need to back up at all, or was the point made?
Point made.
Points made. Okay, very good. So again, that rule came from a good place, but it isn't necessarily a very helpful rule. Because it's the wrong...
Sorry to interrupt. Can you actually just back up a couple slides? It seems like that may be necessary. That was pretty distracting.
Okay, so let me just back up here. I asked you whether you read or listened to me, and the point that I wanted to make here was it doesn't matter what you actually ended up doing. I failed as a presenter because I didn't have a connection between what I was saying and what you were reading on the screen. So here's a better approach. The rule about not reading your slides comes from a good place, and it comes from this place of people were adding way too much text on their slides. They were reading full paragraphs, which was really frustrating people, and then they would end up not saying anything else, and they would just go on to the next slide and do it again. So the fix, which was the rule about not reading your slides, is actually the fix for the wrong problem, or it's the wrong fix for the problem, I should say, because there is this, and science backs this up, this notion, what's called cognitive load. Now, cognitive load, let me just define it for you here. This is from the International Institute for Innovative Instruction. It's the amount of working memory that's being used. It's like the RAM on your computer, only for the human brain. When memory usage on your computer is high, the system starts to slow down and it doesn't function as efficiently. And the same thing happens with learning. So cognitive load was a term that was derived for elementary kids. Actually, they were trying to answer the question, why are kids being distracted by their teacher's message? Now, the American Psychological Association has a slightly different definition, but it's in the same it's in the same vein, which is the relative demand imposed by a particular task in terms of mental resources required. And it's also called mental load or mental workload. So let me give you a few examples out in the world of how our cognitive load is being overtaxed. So here we have an image of Brooke Baldwin, and her piece is about herself. She's celebrating 10 years at CNN. But there are distractions here on the screen that are taking away from her primary message. So the second message on the screen is something about Facebook here on this scroller. And they still go on to confuse us even more by amping up our cognitive load by showing us the NASDAQ research or the NASDAQ results that day. So the news channels get this wrong. Now that I have shown this to you, watch the news tonight. You will be shocked at how much cognitive load they are piling onto us, and they have no idea that they're messing up their message. Now, if you've ever texted and driven, you know that this also adds to your cognitive load. Even if you aren't typing and you're just reading somebody else's text, you cannot do that and keep the car on the road safely. And you know, let's not even talk about the position that you're putting other people in when you choose to text and drive. So that's about the cognitive load. So the better solution from never reading your slides is to simplify your content. And you're simplifying that content for you, because we want to reduce your cognitive load, and for your audience. So that means that you need to read. And if you just can't quite get there to acknowledge or to get yourself to read the slides, at least acknowledge what's there on the screen. So there we have the final myth or rule debunked, which was never ever read your slides. Now I want to go
Can I interrupt for just
please,
a second? Yeah. I think that the analogy I always use, so first of all, let me back up. The idea that you're using a slide, bringing a slide into the conversation is easy to talk about when you forget about slides for a bit and talk about bringing other things into the conversation. Now, sometimes I talk about this in terms of show and tell, when kids bring things to school and they say, look at this, here's something I brought in to show you. There's that. But in a business setting, if we're working with engineers, for example, and they bring in an object, maybe they want to show how a valve works, maybe, and they bring in the thing and they show it to the audience. They are usually much, much more clear with that explanation than they would be if they were trying to use a slide to describe the same thing, simply because it's natural for them to realize, oh, I'm showing you this thing, so that means I need to point out its features, point out what it does, talk about how it functions in the real world, all of those things. And it's a really natural way to use a visual aid effectively. And I think that the fact that we're using slides just gets in the way of that natural connection, because people, if you're following these rules of never reading the slide or making the slide, this simple or that many words, it gets in the way of your natural ability to explain it, which is why and I think you're going to talk about this, why many times very, very complicated slides are perfectly appropriate for what you want to deliver.
Yeah. So let's go ahead and get into that. I love that idea of the show and tell. So there are additional ways to reduce cognitive load for both the audience and for you. And we can't stress this enough. We're reducing cognitive load for both parties, you, the presenter, and the audience. So let's take a look at 3 different types of visual aids that we would typically see. On the left-hand side, there are notes. As you can see, Dale delivered a slide very similar to this, and it was a reference for him. Now, he doesn't have to memorize what's on that slide. He can simply refer to the slide as he is delivering it. So that's how you would how we would recommend delivering a slide that tends to be wordy and is organized in a series of bullets. Now, in the middle of our screen here, we've got what we would consider a traditional visual aid. It's meant to communicate very quickly. You've seen the picture of the eye contact there. This is the format that billboard designers follow, right? But their number one goal is to not kill you as you're driving down the highway. So the idea is to get a very quick snapshot of what you're trying to convey. But on the other hand, and Dale, this gets back to the point that you were making earlier, sometimes a visual aid is a document, and that's okay. You do not need to apologize for the fact that you've got a really busy slide, but you do want to be able to, like show and tell, walk people through where you want them to look. So as the next slide shows here, we've got this lady delivering a presentation, and she's actually walked to the screen and she's pointing out the orange part of the pie there. So you want to make slides part of the conversation. The slides aren't a separate communication channel. They are part of the conversation that you're leading. So that means then, as we've established, you need to control where they look. So how do we do that? Well, as I said earlier, we point. That's perfectly legal. We can add animation. Now, animation is different when you are presenting virtually than it is live face-to-face. Live face-to-face, a lot of animation can become distracting and annoying, adding to cognitive load. We would make the argument that in the virtual space, adding animation actually reduces cognitive load because you're actually helping people understand where you want them to look. And then you can also use descriptive language. If we were to use this image of this woman here that we're talking about, she might say something about the upper right graph. She might also say, ignore the graph in the upper right. I want to bring your focus to the orange slice of the pie chart. Now, I'm pretty sure that as I was talking through those things, your eye went exactly where I wanted it to go. So as you are thinking about preparing yourself for an orderly conversation, another thing you want to think about is, how am I going to deliver this in a way where I can control where people are looking? And you can also use the zoom in using the magnifying tool. You may not have even known that this tool exists in PowerPoint because it's relatively new. But when you are in slideshow in PowerPoint, you can now use the magnifying tool, and then you can drag and drop your slide wherever you want people to focus. It's a pretty cool tool. I also want to talk about crafting useful slide titles. So, Dale introduced us to Jennifer, one of the characters in our book. We have another character named Lewis. Now, he is a very high energy guy. He's disorganized, he's in his head, and he's forgetful. So I like to think about Lewis when I wrote him as being like this firefly, sort of, just bouncing from topic to topic to topic. So because he is doing that, and his cognitive load is already amped up, he needs to work even harder to keep himself focused. So one of the ways he can do that is by crafting very specific slide titles. So here is, in the world of the book, the slide that Lewis shows us. The problem with this slide is that gross sales means absolutely nothing. It doesn't do enough to get him focused on what he wants to actually say about this slide. So now I have changed the slide title to month-over-month sales growth. That tees up a very specific conversation and gets his brain where it needs to be, again, reducing cognitive load. Now, it also reduces the cognitive load for his audience as well. Now, let's say, though, that where Lewis wants to take the conversation is actually this bump in sales between April and May. So you might add some sort of a trigger. Now, for him, he put that oval there, but it could be bolded words, an arrow, something circled, whatever it is. It's just something that draws your attention in. You also want to create clear labels. So let's just focus on this very simple graphic that is on the screen right now. Without doing too much work, you can get your arms around what it is trying to convey. Now, our friends over at Mind Tools, this is actually one of their examples. They say a label diagram places a lower demand on working memory than one that has labels listed at the side. So I'm going to show you another version of this same graphic that actually adds to cognitive load. Simply because the labels are not actually on the graphic itself, you have to work way too hard to make sense of it. So it's a very simple thing. Label your graphics in a way that will make understanding easier. So I'm hoping that over the course of our time together so far, we've made the case that by following these rules, again, that were designed to solve problems, but they're the wrong solution to the problem, actually increases cognitive load for everybody. Now, in the registration for today's webinar, we thought we would have some fun, and we actually asked you, what are some of the rules that you have heard that you either don't find helpful or you start to question? So thank you very much. We've got a big list of things that we're going to talk about here. Dale, I saw you, I heard you take a big breath. Did that mean you wanted to say something?
No, it
Oh,
was just a big breath.
it was just a big breath. Well, I hope you're not bored with me.
No, I'll go off. I'll go on mute if you want.
Good plan. All right. So we asked you, what other rules have you heard? Memorize your slides and or your opening. Ay. The memorizing thing is, you got to stop telling people, or the people need to stop telling other people to memorize your slides. Why is that? First of all, memorizing is what actors do when they rehearse. Now, I know this very well because I started my life as an actor. And what you are doing in rehearsal is you are trying to perfect the moments so that you can recreate that every single night so that the audience has the same experience night after night after night. That's not what we're doing here in a business presentation. So memorizing your slides is a garbage recommendation. What's better? Trim those notes down, or trim the slides down to the very minimum, treat them as notes. Now, the other part of this is about the opening. We really do not recommend memorizing your opening. And the reason for that is because you have to place a business conversation within the context that's taking place. In other words, you have to glue what you're about to say to what has just happened, because a presentation doesn't happen just within its own confines. It's actually taking place within a meeting. And there's clearly, even if you're the very first presentation in the meeting, there's something that took place prior. So memorizing, not good. This one, picturing people naked or in their underwear. I mean, talk about adding to cognitive load. You just don't need to do that. It's a terrible idea. I can't even imagine where this one came from. I guess
It came from, this is an old one, and sorry, it's one of the first books on this topic I ever read. It's an equalizer. It's to take away their power. It's there. That's why it's there. It makes no sense. But since I've interrupted you, Jay's iPhone uh, made a comment that's really good in chat and says, if you have a PowerPoint accompanying a training manual, some want the entire manual in the slides. And that is a very good concern and very true. You need to make sure those things are useful for the delivery of the training.
I actually prepared a slide to talk about that in case somebody brought it up.
Oh, good.
I'm gonna go rogue here. Bear with me for just a second while I find that slide, because it is not in the order that I necessarily would want it to be in. Okay, I found it. Let me share my slide with you. Okay, Jay's iPhone. I'm not sure if your first name is Jay, but I'll refer to you as Jay. And of course, I shared the wrong darn slide. Bear with me for just a second again here.
Jennifer.
Jennifer, okay. Sorry about, not only did I get your name wrong, but I misgendered you as well. Well, I don't know why PowerPoint wants to keep taking me to that slide. Let's try this one more time. No, okay. Look away, folks. I don't want to make you dizzy. I'm tired of messing around here. Here we go. Okay, so I showed you this slide right here, and I delivered it using different words, and I was causing that cognitive load for you. If there is good reason, like maybe this slide is going to be a takeaway, and you want people to have a hard copy of it, and all of that context, all of those sentences are necessary for the handout to make sense in the absence of a presentation. This is something you might do for the presentation. Simply highlight the most important pieces that you want to make sure that people take away. And during the presentation, you can say, you know, I know there's a lot of stuff on this slide, but the areas I want to draw your focus to are what's bolded and in red. And then you're letting people off the hook from having to deal with all that other stuff, and it still serves as a decent visual aid. Okay, so look away again. I'm going to fast forward to where I was. There we are, back to naked people. Let's move on from that. Don't repeat yourself. Okay, this is a rule that we hear quite often, and I think it comes from a very real place, which is people who are not concise and are constantly going back and repeating themselves. Now, the reason they're doing that probably is that they just simply want to make sure that they've been heard. Now, we can address that by saying, let's try to be more concise. But I also want to put into check this idea that you should never repeat yourself, because if we go back to this idea of education, by repeating, you're more likely to make sure that what you are saying has been heard and understood. So a little bit of repeating is okay. When it becomes too much and it's distracting, that is when we need to pull back from all of the repeating of yourself.
It might be too that they're just connecting dots. You know what I mean?
Yep.
The making things extra clear for people that may have missed it.
Yep. So don't acknowledge your nervousness. This is a really interesting one. You know, we've probably all seen someone who is visibly nervous. They're shaking, their voice is shaking, they're having a hard time just getting through the presentation. They are trying their absolute best. Now, sometimes they will even make the comment, boy, I'm really nervous, or something like that. I don't think that's a bad thing. If that's what they need to do to work through their nervousness, then that's kind of what they need to do. Now, ideally, we would be able to work with a client ahead of time and help them reduce that nervousness, so acknowledging it wouldn't even be an issue. Dale, do you have anything to add to that?
Well, I think that it goes back to trying to be perfect.
Right.
It's admitting that you're not perfect and you're struggling a bit right now. And I think your next one is about technology.
Yep.
Yeah. Pretending you're not. Well, what it says is you don't let them know you're experiencing technical issues. They know. They can tell most likely. So
Well, I just had technical issues a
right,
couple times, right? There was that box on my slide that I didn't even know was there. That's not what I was seeing. But then
right,
also when PowerPoint wouldn't let me go back to that previous slide,
right,
I can't hide that that's happening. So the best I can do is admit I'm human. I'm having some,
right,
struggles here, and fix it and move on.
right.
Yeah.
It's sort of a don't worry, it's just us. If you're having trouble, it's okay to acknowledge it.
I'm reminded of a time I was in the audience at one of those big conferences that I'm sure many of us have been to. And there were many, many, many presentations taking place all over this convention hall. And the presenter, her slides kept advancing without her having clicked the button. And what she eventually realized, and what we all clearly realized, is that there was somebody in one of the other presentations nearby whose clicker was on the same frequency, or whatever you call that, and their clicker was advancing her slides. And she tried to ignore the fact that that was happening. It was like, come on, you're on the struggle bus. We can all see this. Let's be in the same moment together and recognize that how bizarre and frustrating that is.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And then I just added another bullet here about not acknowledging losing your place or your train of thought. You're human. We're all human. We've all been there. We've all done that. So I don't think there's anything wrong with admitting that you just got lost for a second. Take a moment, breathe, pause. You'll get back on track. You're good to go. So I hope that we have been able to help you understand why some of this advice is unhelpful. And I'm hoping that we gave you actionable recommendations for what to do instead. So thanks a lot for joining us today. I want to make a quick commercial for a couple of upcoming webinars. For those of you who have sat through our webinars in the past, you know that we do them on a regular basis for the public. And we're going to do this one in March, the 22nd. We're going to do this one again. And I am really excited about March 23rd. Our dear friend, Kelly Knowles, she is an inner leadership coach. She's a facilitator. She's a speaker. She is an author. She's going to be doing this webinar with us called Standing Out While Standing In: 5 Strategies to Differentiate Yourself with Authenticity and Integrity. And she talks about being a first-generation white-collar worker and how imposter syndrome for her is a real thing, and the fight that she had with herself to break through. So it's a really interesting topic, and it would be really good for those of us who are first generation white collar workers and for those who manage people who are. I really recommend that you stop in and see this webinar. It's going to be a great time, and I will be interviewing Kelly as part of this webinar. So Kevin is going to drop some resources here into chat. I see he's already dropped the registration for those upcoming webinars in. And then we've got the Orderly Conversation available at Amazon and wherever else you buy books. The virtual Orderly Conversation is a free download that you have access to. And then, of course, that blog that we mentioned earlier on about an hour ago about the difference between a speech and a presentation. So thank you very much for joining us today. We had a great time talking with you. And if you need the expertise that we have to bring to your organization, we hope it's us that you call and not one of those competitors who's always talking about speech making and stages and microphones and podiums. So thank you very, very much. It was a pleasure having you, and enjoy the rest of your day. I'm going to take us to gallery view in case anybody wants to ask a question. We are very happy to entertain.